Welcome to Tesseract Podcast, where we unlock your power to innovate. Hi, my name is Matt, and I'm going to be your host today. Tesseract's mission is to empower airmen, connect them to resources, and accelerate change across the Air Force logistics enterprise. Specifically, our team works as an innovation accelerator assigned to the Air Staff Logistics Directorate, where we partner with airmen to operationalize the new sustainment strategy. Heather, thank you so much for joining us today on Tesseract Podcast. I think it's going to be a unique episode. We've never had anyone from the Air War College here, so thank you so much for coming on. So how did you end up at the Air War College and being a professor and getting so interested in, being an aviation enthusiast and military history?
Well, it all started as long ago as I can remember. I like to say that I've been studying the Marine Corps my whole life because one of my earliest memories is realizing that there was such a thing as the Marine Corps, and my dad had served in it. And he used to say, I was about to be enlisted into the Army during Vietnam. I was about to be drafted, actually. And he said the Army wasn't tough enough for him. And so he had to go into the Marine Corps. So, the question of, well, why did he think the Marine Corps was tough and the Army wasn't? Things like that always intrigued me. There's also my dad's very deep sense of discipline and duty. And so I decided that I wanted to study the Marine Corps. And when I went into the archives for the first time, I was reading about the Mexican-American War. And I'll try to cut this short just because I know everyone wants to hear about the Air Force more than the Marine Corps. But there I was reading about the Marines in the Mexican-American War, and they didn't seem to be anything like the Marines that everyone knows so well today. They even called themselves soldiers. And so that became my project, how did the few become the proud? And then I somehow, life throws you paths and curveballs that you never anticipated. I never thought I would teach Airpower, but it turns out that I actually find it a lot more intellectually interesting than studying land power. And I love the sort of the theory and the ideas that underpin Airpower. So I've really enjoyed my almost 7 years down at Maxwell now.
Let's start digging. Let's take a deep dive right into our current state as an Air Force. Accelerate, Change, or Lose has been around for the last couple of years. And despite this entire history of us being full throttle in change and being thought leaders in technology, and frankly, being one of the most innovative organizations that the world has ever seen for large periods of time.
Well, I think that the first thing is that you mention innovation, you mention technology. And I think that when the Air Force thinks about change, it tends to gravitate towards stuff. And I think that if we took a huge step back and thought more about the ideas of what we're trying to do, rather than the stuff that we need to do it, that it would put us in a better spot. And it seems to me that ever since we sort of pivoted to China, once we got out of the global war on terror and tried to focus on potential challenges with China, that we realized we were behind in stuff. And then we began, and this is not just the Air Force, I think it's DOD writ large, began running around like chickens without our heads on and chasing different technologies. There would be like a technology of the year. For example, hypersonics is one of them. And so I think that rather than prioritize the tools that we need to be asking the questions that we need to solve. For example, how do we get access? And always thinking about the questions that we need to be pursuing helps us to get around sort of chasing different tools. There's also the idea of that I think could be problematic, but I'm not sure how much this is true or not. But there's the idea of just change for change's sake. And so sometimes if it comes down from on high that we need lots of change, we see lots of change emanating up from the tactical level, but to what end? What is the strategic vision that we're pursuing? And one of the interesting case studies of failure of innovation if you think about the different levels of war, arguably is helicopters in Vietnam. Helicopters, operationally and tactically, were amazing contributors to the Army's efforts in Vietnam. However, some have argued that at the strategic level, they were a disaster because they enabled a strategy that let us avoid gaining control on the ground and just sort of skipping around. And so that was very problematic, arguably, for trying to win a counterinsurgency fight. So you can have all the change in the world, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to be the right change if you're not overarchingly setting out a strategy into which these tactical level innovations and adaptations should go. And then I think that also leads us into the differences between innovation and adaptation. And I think, use them often as synonyms in the Air Force. And I think it's useful to look at them along a sliding scale of innovation being something very, very unique and very, very novel, where adaptation is more of an evolutionary process. But even then, if you think about, for example, a nuclear bomb, in many ways, that is very innovative. It has a huge amount of destruction. On the other hand, it's also, you can look at it as adaptation because it's just a bomb. So you always have to sort of think about that sliding scale, and very few things are truly innovative, which would lead me to one more point, and that's if you look at, anything about air power since Operation Desert Storm, you are more likely than not to find the word revolutionary thrown in. And I guess historians like to rain on everyone's parade and be like, there's nothing new under the sun, guys, calm down. But continually from Operation Desert Storm till today, any air power book you pick up, this is so revolutionary, this is so revolutionary, this is so revolutionary. Guys, calm down. In fact, in many ways, the same things that we are doing with air power since today, we've been doing since World War I. So it's really easy to get caught up in the technological change and miss the huge continuities in air power development.
Yeah, I'd like to touch on your first piece with the technical focus in the Air Force. That's something that I've touched on quite a few podcasts recently. And I think it's a byproduct of the bureaucracy and the bureaucratic mechanisms that have existed over the last 30, 40, 50 years, or at least actually throughout the existence of the military industrial complex period, where we have predictable systems. We have we like to quantify our not only our successes, but we like to quantify, what we are doing with X amount of dollars and X amount of vehicles. We find ourselves also, specifically as an air power entity, focused on and I've mentioned this book also in other podcasts, but I just like to double and triple and quadruple tap it: the culture of military organizations, where it dives into, hey, air power leaders love to lean on the fact that they can measure the tonnage that, of bombs that was dropped. They love to measure the mission capable rate of aircraft. They love to measure the endless amount of metrics that we can as an air power entity, yet we have traditionally failed to measure the culture and health of airmen, right, and the true readiness of the individual warfighter, at least when it comes to technically focused branches of service like the Navy or the Air Force, where the Army and the Marine Corps don't necessarily have that problem as much, because that soldier, that Marine, is the weapon system, right? So those are some of my those have been my thoughts on that as I've reflected over the last couple of years. But to dive into your definitions of innovation and adaptation, and I find it that there's there's a culminating point where a product or a solution or a process hits, and that line isn't clear, But as soon as it meets that mark, it's considered an innovation, right? Like I was reading Rule the Waves. And have you read Rule the Waves yet?
Have not.
Great book on sea power, and it talks about Connex boxes and how Connex boxes were an innovation. Well, a Connex box is just a box, right? It's just a box, but it's a bigger box that is modular and is now adaptable to fit on not only ships, but 18 wheelers. And it has truly revolutionized the way that we've shipped products. But at the end of the day, it's just a box.
I think that that example that you gave of the Connex boxes really goes along with sort of what I've been thinking about today, as I've been trying to think what I wanted to say today. And it goes again to my ideas and tools. That the reason that the Connex box was so successful and so important was because it wasn't that it was a new box. It was that you were thinking about a box differently and bringing together two or maybe even more different areas of purpose and melding them together to make it seamless. And so I think that that's where creativity so often occurs. And that's why it's so good for people to get out of their own domains and think about other domains or read about a period of history that's totally, I mean, if you're an airman, read about like ancient Greek hoplite warfare. I mean, just different things to spark new ideas. And that's where some really creative magic that can come that can allow some change to occur in maybe non-traditional ways when we're just thinking about, okay, how are we going to make the pilot experience, better or faster? And that seems to be a lot of what is getting the attention and accelerating change
Mm-hmm.
from
So
my perspective.
speaking of history, what is your favorite case study in the evolution and innovation and adaptation in the military? Not, I mean, this doesn't have to be air power history. This can be any part of history.
There's so many answers that I could give. I always like the beginnings of things when it's everything is just beginning. Before I decided to study war, I actually thought about going to seminary and studying church history. And I was interested in the early church, the first church. And I find myself drawn to the beginning of air power history. I think that I guess as a historian, what I increasingly realize, though, is that when we think about our early history, we read so much of World War II backwards into our early history that it can be problematic in ways. And then that poses a problem for me as a historian who's more of an applied historian now that I am in the PME world about like how much do you balance sort of the breadth of study and the width of study to get historical mindedness in military officers in a way that's meaningful? And that can take us down our PME, continually go back to my PME trail. So we may not want to do that. But I think it is a fascinating period when you look at it outside of how we know the story turned out over the skies of Germany and Japan.
I forgot which historian it was. I think it was Richard Overy. He talked about how the reason we gravitate to World War II is because it's such a clear picture of good and evil. And it's really the last time that we've had a conflict that we've had the moral high ground in the clearest sense, right? We are defeating nations that are exterminating, millions of people simply because of what they believe in, right? So as historians, it's easy to look at, it's easy to study, and I mean that's why you see that not just my bookshelves. I mean, I say that as I look at my shelves over here in my World War II section, it's probably the biggest part of my library, right? But how do we diversify that
Our course has recently gone through, I'm the course director of the Airpower Strategy and Operations course, which is an old course, but through tons of updates over the summer for this year. It is very new in terms of the whole banner of accelerate, change, or lose. One of the critiques that we had from outsiders was that our course used to be the World War II course. Now, I don't agree with that, but that was the critique. My counter argument to those who say that World War II is not worth studying, I understand that um, if we do, and I hope we don't get into a peer on peer conflict, that if it turns into something like World War III, it would not be replicating World War II, that we can't just go back and fight World War II again. That's not going to happen. However, at a deeper level, what's so valuable about World War II is that it wasn't just a conventional war with these great battles on the battlefield. There were so many varieties of air power. There's so many different applications of it that's why I think World War II is still so very valuable. Also, another war similar to that is the Vietnam War. Huge breadth of air power application. I mean, going back to World War II, so many theaters from mobility to strategic bombing or strategic attack or whatever you want to call it to more tactical air power. Just something that's hard to really, you just can't skip World War II.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that there's so many amazing case studies when you look at the interwar period, with the United States Army, and then with the Air Corps, and then also throughout the conflict, as you look at the way the Marine Corps was able to adapt to amphibious warfare, the way an interesting tiny vignette with the story of sonar that was actually an not necessarily invented, but discovered by a young petty officer. That wasn't done by a scientist, right? And then also with when I was talking to General Barno and Dr. Bensahel about the Rhino tanks in Normandy, that was done by a sergeant that just challenge challenged the status quo and made change possible. So there are a lot of great little tidbits there to pull from. But when we look at our history as an air power entity in our heritage, what do you think is the most important thing that we should reflect on? Because as an airman, sometimes I feel like our heritage is lost because we're looking so far forward and we're always looking at the next technology and the next big thing, as you mentioned earlier. So, what do you think we should reflect on?
The first thing that I struggle um, with, I think, at Air Command and Staff College is that students may, and I'm not sure, but I have the sense that they think that history and heritage are synonymous. And I think there are critical differences between the two. I think that they come to ACSC and they expect that we are going to give them heritage, and instead we give them history. And it's very hard for them to swallow because they're so different and they serve different purposes. So let me take a step back and define them for how I see them. I see heritage as the stories that we tell about past members in our institution that we look up to, the sort of the good motivation stories that help instill identity and a sense of belonging in people. That has a very important purpose in motivation and things like that. However, history looks at the past from the exact opposite way. It's very critical. It takes those same leaders and shows all their warts, all their skeletons, all their potential mistakes. And so you really have to be that's one thing that I think is very important for the Air Force to understand, especially when they get to PME and they may be confused that we are not here to tell feel good cheerleading stories about the Air Force. We are here to be critical so that we can learn sort of the foundational ideas so that we don't make mistakes. So in terms of Air Force history, I think one of the interesting things that comes out of World War I is that we really go down the strategic bombing route. I don't think that early airmen got air power right, but I also don't think that early soldiers would have gotten air power more correct. Both went too far towards sort of a land-centric view of air power by the Army and too independent of a air view by airmen. And there was a middle ground that needed to be explored more fully. However, counter arguments, it's the Great Depression. There's only so much you can do. And then, really, for the next couple of decades, all the way through Vietnam, early airmen, continued to be too independently minded, tended to be too extreme. Finally, after the Vietnam War, the airmen swung the other way in many ways with the rise of the fighter generals, and we became too tactical. We became too focused on land-centric air power, arguably. And so we just kind of swung from one direction back to the other. So today, I think always trying to figure out that balance between what more independent missions supporting the joint fight. I want to stress the independent missions support the joint fight. They aren't separate to it, versus more narrow traditional support is a difficult balance to strike, as well as also the balance, and it's hard because air power history still doesn't have this right, the balance between sort of kinetic bomb dropping and non-kinetic uses of air power, which are have been some of the most successful uses of air power in history, but everyone tends to sort of gravitate towards the kinetic, and that's partly just because we don't have enough good writing about that area, those areas yet.
Mm-hmm. Just to touch back on, you talked about how essentially we get in our own way, right? And looking at the years of Billy Mitchell and how much of a maverick he was to really make air power top of mind of everybody, or at least national security practitioners, and in the interwar period, and then obviously like late World War One. But Williamson Murray highlighted something in, I forgot which book it was, but he talked about how the Air Tactical School actually stifled innovation in ways, because if you weren't in that camp and if you didn't think exactly like them, then you were shunned, like you were out of the club. And I just find that dichotomy so interesting, because you're talking about the Air Tactical School, which is trying to be forward thinking, and they think that they have the next evolution of warfare, right? And a lot of the things that they did envision, some of it did come to fruition, right? But obviously it wasn't 100%. And they thought that they were being those forward thinkers, but at the same time, they were not open to any other thoughts. And to your point, military mavericks have had that same type of mentality, over the decades, and then maybe that works to their benefit and maybe that works to their detriment. But one of my favorite individuals in Air Force history, and he is underrated and not talked about enough in Air Force circles, is John Boyd.
Well, I always go back to Sun Tzu, and probably it's mistranslated, but if you just know your enemy, then you'll be fine. And it's really, really, really hard to know your enemy, even in, say, like Operation Allied Force, where Wesley Clark had met Milosevic. Still, we don't even to this day really know why that coercion worked. And so even in our best, most recent case studies, we still have a giant question mark, and that really goes to the unpredictability of human nature, which goes back to your differentiation between sort of how we quantify versus how we qualify, which is a hard problem for the Air Force, because we just can't always see our progress like the Army can if it's sort of a nice, neat, linear battlefield.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of Sun Tzu, I we when we look at the PLA's doctrine, and we look at how, you know, the Indo-PACOM theater is evolving and elevating in, to be top of mind for everybody in the national security space. Uh, the PLA draws back to the Gulf War, right? And that's been pretty well cited, that that was like their aha moment, that this is the future of conflict. And so taking, our thought leadership and innovation, and our thoughts on innovation, um, and then molding that with their, leaning into Sun Tzu, obviously, and then translating that into unrestricted warfare, which I'm sure you've read. Outstanding book. No excuse not to read it. It's this big, right? It's super tiny. Um, and a- and how do we see ourselves in, you know in the future? What do you see the um, you know understanding the past gives us a good picture of what the future is going to look like, or at least, the history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, as historians like to say. Can you paint a picture of what you think the future of air power looks like?
I think that it will be that balance between continuity and change, where the most fundamental ideas of military history will continue to predominate. As you get down towards the tactical, that you will see more change. That the basic roles and missions of air power will be similar to what they have been in the past. I am curious the extent to which the Chinese um, will copy us in some areas and depart from our practices in other ways. I know it's a buzzword, but sort of like what will they be thinking out of the box? How the one of the questions that I think is important to consider is how symmetrically they might seek to be, how asymmetrically they may seek to be. Some of the challenges in um, developing some technology ahead of us, and so then we possibly get caught making costly decisions in pursuing technology, certain pieces of technology that we may not be a wise and sound investment. I tend to think that if you just read Clausewitz and get the basic ideas and you study air power history, that you basically have the fundamentals right, and the fundamentals are the most important thing. um I I think that you can't predict the future at all, um, but you can kind of guess at it. But there's a lot of great work that comes out about, how you're going to guess wrong. And so once you get into wartime, the race to learn the lessons first, to let those be decentralized. And this comes from Michael Hunsaker's Dying to Learn, be decentralized in testing on the battlefield, then brought in and tested by the most rigorous thinkers that you have in your institution, and then centralized in terms of disseminating them back out to the institution. I don't know how well the Air Force is suited for that. I think that the the having our doctrine at Air University and our sort of TTPs and the weapons school out at Nellis causes a break in our sort of intellectual holism, for lack of a word that I don't like. I think that we put TTPs on a pedestal and we kind of laugh at our doctrine. And I don't think that that's healthy for an institution. So those are a bunch of random ideas put
No,
together.
I love it. No, I love it because in the conversation, to draw back to the adaptability conversation I had yesterday, when we think about the foundation of an adaptable force, I think that the evolution of doctrine is crucial, and the emphasis on doctrine is crucial. And when we look at, like, let's say in particular, to highlight AFPD1 or DP1, I forgot the exact acronym, but Air Force Doctrinal Publication 1 on mission command, right? And that is a 16-page document that just gives you all the bullet points of Clausewitz. It's essentially the Spark Notes of MCPD1. Um, and I think as an air power entity, and especially like in combat mission support units, we are centralized in decision making, and we are centralized in execution as well, which I think inhibits our flexibility, which is probably one of the most important attributes to maintaining tempo in the battle space, right? And if we aren't sharing our doctrine, and doctrine is there for everyone to be on the same page, but no one is turning the page of that doctrine, then that's a problem, right? And the emphasis, as you said, on TTPs, it continues to attribute to our focus on the technical nature of our job versus the enhancement of strategic thinking, which has been popularly cited across many historians. I think in General Zinni's book, he highlights it very clearly, like, hey, like there are strategy documents, there's doctrine all over the place, but rarely does it ever interconnect to be something that, and I don't want to use another buzzword here, but synergistic to advance our overarching national security strategy, right? And I think those are all, everything that you just said was resonating with me, and all these dots are connecting. Not to use another buzzword.
It's hard. We speak a different language, even if we don't even realize it.
Yeah. Just to take a dive back into history, when I had a conversation with David Maxwell, and he was telling me that if you read Clausewitz and Sun Tzu, that can inform you to make that can take you down the intellectual process to solve any national security problem in the future. And I find that that tidbit and that advice just so poignant, right? Just because we're talking about words that are written on pages hundreds of years ago, that are still relevant today. And I think just taking students down the pages of history, so they're able to write the future, is just so crucial.
Yeah, and I think what I was trying to say earlier, and I thought of it now in terms of an onion, is that when you first read any theorist, you're just trying to peel back the initial skin and
Mhm.
understand, okay, what are their basic ideas? And reading someone like Clausewitz, that's really, really, really hard. But then once you do that, another onion skin needs to be sort of, okay, well, what's the context in which they're writing? Because that helps you understand, okay, well, what actually are they saying? And then you have to keep digging and digging. Okay, well, people have read and understood the person differently. So which person do I think is more correct, and why? And so even someone like Sun Tzu, who seems to be kind of cookie cutter or fortune cookie military theory, there are people that come out and say that we're totally misreading him in the West, and we have no idea what we're doing, and all we're doing is teaching these ideas badly. John Sullivan is actually a good example of that, if you want to check him out in the Strategy Bridge, if you're not familiar with him. So that's one of those problems with knowledge, is that It's really very, very, very subjective. And it's again this challenge of providing education to, I hate the word, but it just comes to mind anyway, to the warfighter, with how do we give you that depth to use it correctly? And it's a scary prospect. No, I think it's a really important that you're talking about the top down change, the bottom up change, and that isn't enough connective tissue to make change work. There has to be some organization in place that can see the process through. And so, again, that may explain the why we feel a little bit like chickens without our heads running around, because the you can sort of tell people to change, but it doesn't work that easily. And especially again, when we're struggling for resources, you have to make tough changes. And that's why I would rather have the strategic reasoning, the ideas out there, the questions to help illuminate always what problems are we trying to solve, and then how does this new tool help solve that problem? To what extent does it help solve the problem? Is it the best tool? And it all has to be thought of together and not just sort of, pick and choose at the Golden Corral buffet.
Yeah, I love how you highlight that. And just to bring up, we talked about helicopters earlier in the conversation, air mobility, and not to keep on talking about adaptation under fire, but in my recent conversation, we mentioned that, or Dr. Bensahel mentioned that they recommended a change. Well, they brought up a recommendation based off of what's happening in the war in Ukraine, and they are doubting the efficacy of, or the capability rather, of air mobility in a future fight. And like, of course, that's going to make some people's heads explode, right? Like, hey, what do you mean? Like, this is our primary mechanism to, get troops, into combat, right? It's a key element of air power, but it might not be a viable option in the future. Same thing as we look at, force design with tanks, right? Hey, we want to be more agile, and just giving out that strategic reasoning. And then to refer back to, we were talking about A-10s a little bit. Just because there's a cult like following, hey, I love being A-10. I love that airframe. However, is that a viable platform? Does the F-35 provide the same capabilities? Most people would say yes, right? Or the experts would say yes. And we should not retain an asset based off of
Feelings.
political considerations, or just because someone likes a Bert, right? Or or just, yeah, thinks they're cool. So we talked about a lot here. We've talked about adaptation and innovation and your perspective on it. We've talked about the evolution of air power. We've talked about historians. We've talked about reflecting on, or the difference between history and heritage. What else would you like to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
Well, you mentioned Williamson Murray, and he provides one of my very favorite quotes that I think is so important for military professionals. And I'm going to give you a shortened version of it, but he says, war is an incredibly complex endeavor. It is the most demanding profession, intellectually and morally. So I'm just going to read that again. The most demanding profession intellectually and morally. The cost of slovenly thinking at every level of war can translate into the deaths of innumerable men and women, most of whom deserve better from their leaders. And so sometimes I think that the Air Force may be the most anti-intellectual of the services. Maybe that's not fair. However, I gave the analogy of an onion in terms of learning and how we need to keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. It seems like really the most popular book that is on the reading list of many people is Malcolm Gladwell's The Bomber Mafia. And I'm going to say that that book is great for your first onion layer. Get that skin off, get hooked on Airpower, use it as a gateway drug, and then keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper, because Malcolm Gladwell may tell a good story, but he admits that his primary purpose is not to educate, it's to entertain. So find your Airpower candy of choice that intrigues you and then keep digging deeper and deeper. Again, as Williamson Murray said, the military profession is the most demanding intellectually of any profession, and it is a hard and challenging calling that, if things do not work out as we hope with China, that we will see more loss than we have seen since World War II.
Thank you again for listening to Tesseract Podcast. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and connect with us on LinkedIn. Any references to trademarked, copyrighted, or protected products or services such as books, movies, or businesses are used here for the limited purpose of education and professional development of Air Force Airmen. If you have any questions, please contact us at www.tesseract.af.mil.